I think we are finally ready for introductions. Thanks everybody for handling all the technical issues. We had two things happening. First of all, like links weren't working. People couldn't get into the membership page. And then when you clicked on the link, it was asking for a passcode. So I don't know if everyone is going to be here. There's a lot of people here, which is great. Super excited. We've got 65 people here attending, which is awesome. And hopefully those who can't get in will maybe be able to get in later. So it seemed like it was working for some people, but not for others. But our time is limited. I want to make sure we get to our speaker. So let me introduce Dr. Francis Su. He is the Benedictine Carver Professor of Mathematics at Harvey Mudd College. He served as the president of the Mathematical Association of America from 2015 to 2017 and is currently serving as the vice president of the American Mathematical Society until 2023. Dr. Su has received multiple awards from the MAA, including the Henry L. Adler Award and the Heimel Award, both for distinguished teaching. In addition to his research, he writes about the dignity of human beings and the wonder of mathematical teaching. And his work has been featured in Quantum Magazine, Wired, and the New York Times. If you made it to the 2019 AMATIC conference, you might remember his talk there on mathematics for human flourishing. His 2020 book with the same name went on to win the MAA 2021 Euler Book Prize, which he won along with Christopher Jackson. So without any further ado, let me please welcome, or let us all please welcome Dr. Francis Su.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, even if it's virtual. And I want to talk today a bit about what mathematical virtues. So the title of my talk is Build Virtues, Not Just Skills. And the takeaway from my talk is that we have a lot more to teach in our classes than just skills. But let me start with a question that I'd like you to think about. Just take a moment. So how many times is a toilet flushed in Salt Lake City during a commercial break of the Super Bowl? There's a question. Take a moment, just think about that for a bit. And then in a minute, I'm going to invite you in the chat to throw out an estimate. Don't type in the chat yet until I say so. And we're just throwing out ideas, so this is not a competition. Although the talk, the slide says the interview, and the reason I thought I'd open with this is that a few years ago, a student of mine said that they interviewed for a position in finance on Wall Street. And I said, "Oh, how'd your interview go?" And she said, "Well, they asked me this question." And I said, "Oh, what question?" And she described this question. And I thought that was very intriguing. And part of the thing I want us to think about is why in the world would they ask this question? It was a question like this. It wasn't exactly this question. Okay. Go ahead, type in the chat now, just an estimate. If you have an estimate, how many times the toilet's flushed in New York City, Salt Lake City during a commercial break, Super Bowl. Okay, we have lots of answers here. Thank you for venturing a guess. Oh, I like that one. Great. Interesting to see the variety of responses. Now, here's another question I'd like you also then to type in the chat. Tell me, why do you think this was an interview question? What was the purpose of asking this question? All right. Good. Okay, so many of you are homing in on the reason, which is if you think a little bit about it, a student who's trained in mathematics knows a lot of skills, right? A skill is something like, being able to factor a quadratic, or maybe write the equation of a line or whatever, right? But that wasn't the most interesting thing that that an interviewer could ask. In this case, the interviewer was interested in seeing how a student thinks, right? What's the thought process, right? More important than the actual answer was, in fact, what the interviewer said is, talk me through how you're arriving at your answer, right? And so maybe you start, and this is an example of a problem which has many different ways you could start, right? You might start with the population of Salt Lake City. And if you don't know that, you might estimate, right? Like you might say, oh, okay, I guess I know it's not one of the 10 largest cities, so it can't be more than, have more than 1 million people, right? And then you might, home in from there. Or you might start with what you know about the Super Bowl. There are lots of different ways you could solve this problem. And the interviewer was interested in seeing how this student thinks. By the way, these kinds of questions these estimation problems actually are the basis of an interesting game that, if you're interested in running a competition based on estimation, a former student of mine now works in finance. His name is Andy Niedermeyer, started this game called Estimathon. If you go to estimathon.com, you will see instructions for setting up a game if you want to do this with your students. Their scoring is basically based on setting up so students work in teams. So that's interesting because most math competitions aren't in teams. And they basically have to submit an interval, and you get points if your interval is really narrow and captures the true answers. So it's a fun game you might be interested in playing with your students. But anyways, okay, so I'm starting with this example because this is an example of a virtue, right? A virtue being equality, right? A particular aspect of character. And I like to think of virtue as excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. So there's both a being aspect and a doing aspect. Now, of course, when people say virtue, often you think of moral virtues, right? So it's the first thing you go to, right? Like honesty, uprightness, truthfulness. And yes, those are virtues, but I like to think of virtues as being maybe a little broader than that. So a virtue might be something like persistence in problem solving, right? So there's a being aspect to that, but I'm a persistent person. But there's a doing aspect, so that the aspect of character leads to a certain way of being, aspect of conduct. And mathematics and mathematical teaching, I think, should be building virtues, right? Like curiosity and creativity, right? These are also virtues. So skills are things like recalling facts, algorithms, being able to do certain things, take a derivative, factor a polynomial. But virtues are things like being able to interpret, to define, to quantify, to abstract, to visualize, to strategize, right? These are all things that we teach our students, often implicitly, and we often don't bring it out when we talk about it in the classroom, right? We don't necessarily help students see that this is part of what we want them to do. And if you think a little bit about it, skills are actually replaceable, right? Anything a student learns how to do long division, you know what? A calculator can do it and do it much faster, right? Certainly it's helpful if you're thinking about a problem to, that involves polynomials, to know how to factor. That's true, right? But more than that, what's important is being able to think and to reason, right? Skills are replaceable. And virtues, on the other hand, that is exactly what an employer is looking for, right? A virtue like being persistent, being creative, being able to solve problems you've never seen before, those are valuable, right? Those aren't, at least not yet, replaceable by artificial intelligence, right? So, uh, so, when you think about virtues, of course, you see some evidence of that in the core standards that many teachers follow from in K through 12. There's the content standards, which often are skills. There's the practice standards, which are often virtues. Like these are some of the practice standards: making sense of problems and persevering in solving them. Right, being able to reason abstractly or construct viable arguments. Right, these are aspects of character that are virtues. But I'd like to say again, I think the practice standards, I think they're great, but I think they're missing other virtues that also make for a meaningful life. So I give you an example of something that I think is missing. A few years ago, our department at Harvey Mudd, Mudd's a science and engineering school in California, so all our students are interested in doing science of some kind. And in fact, many of them come in with a strong math background. That's not surprising. But one of the things that I think is often missing when we talk about the mathematical experience for kids is the goals are often things like students should be able to know and to do. But what about being, right? Like one of the things as we thought about revising our math goals, one of the questions we asked was, well, gosh, where in this is there, and don't we actually want our students to enjoy math, to actually love, to appreciate the beauty, fun, and power of mathematics? So that actually became one of our goals, that students ought to be able to appreciate the beauty, the fun, and the power of mathematics. They should have an affection for mathematics. That's a virtue as well. So what does a great math education build? It builds affection for math. It builds in us an expectation of enchantment, right? One of the things that often happens when you solve a problem and maybe there's a surprising solution or maybe it's beautiful, is that you get enchanted. You begin to crave that feeling of wanting to do another problem with a beautiful solution. It builds in us hopefulness, right? The hopefulness that, this is often underestimated, but the practice of sitting down with a math problem and learning how to sit there and persist and be hopeful in getting an answer. And then often getting an answer builds in us a quality of character. It's a hopefulness that we actually have, hard problems, that hard problems can be solved. And I wouldn't take that for granted, because if you grow up in an environment where you see regularly hard problems that aren't being solved, you might not have that hope. And that's one of the reasons why math is a great equalizer, the math education is, because it builds in us hopefulness. Building in us the disposition to beauty, right? The predisposition to expect and to look for beauty. It builds in us habits of generalization. That's one of the most important virtues of mathematics, I would say, right? Like being able to look at this and look at this and see the same thing is like, whoa, make a connection. That's often leads to other experiences where you're looking for being able to generalize patterns that you see. So there's a lot of things that we are teaching in our classrooms that we often don't emphasize. And so I'm calling us to think a little bit more about how we might emphasize those things. So beyond just, virtues that help you get a good job, virtues make your life richer. That's one of the points that I like to drive home, is that, ideally, a great math education should enable greater human flourishing. And I like to think of, the human flourishing is a term that, philosophers often talk about, like, what is the good life? What does it mean to live life well? What does it mean to flourish even in difficult circumstances, right? And certainly, you can flourish. You might be encountering a hard problem, but you can be flourishing in actually sitting down and being able to think through and solve that problem, right? That's an aspect of what it means to live life well and to be a good human being. Okay, so I've said a lot about virtues, and maybe the mini points here are virtues are what employers are looking for if you want to be really utilitarian about it. They can't be replaced by computers or artificial intelligence, which is, you know, a risk with almost any skill that you learn, is that that skill is going to be outdated. But they make your life richer as well. And they provide a better answer to the question, why do I need to know this stuff? Which is a question I'm sure all of us have both asked and answered, right? It's often, you know, when I'm teaching some subject, I often think, gosh, why am I teaching this? Like, do my kids really need to know blankety blank, whatever it is? And, you know, I've been trying to teach this a certain subject, but I don't necessarily, can't see ahead, right? Well, you know what? Now, if somebody asks me this question, instead of saying, because you're going to need to know it later, which, you know what, is often not true, right? I instead point to the fact that one of the things I want you to get out of this class, I'll say, is the ability to look at a hard problem, to struggle with it for a while, and to be able to solve problems that you've never seen before, right? Who doesn't want to have that virtue? Virtues are human, right? They're in fact what make the classroom or workplace a place of wonder, delight, joy. And one of the best ways to cultivate virtue in the classroom is to attend to people's basic human desires. Everybody's born with basic desires, right? A desire for beauty, a desire for truth, a desire for community, right? So take a moment, like what I'd like you to do is to think of a hobby that you have, something you enjoy doing. And then ask yourself, what inspires you to pursue that hobby? What basic human need is being met through that hobby? And if you don't mind, in the chat, if you're willing, go ahead and type in a hobby you have and what desire of yours is being met through that hobby. Feel free to take a moment. Yes, great. So lots of great answers here. Fellowship, golfing and fellowship or community, having community with other people. Creative outlets like sewing or playing piano or playing an instrument. Feels good to make something, right? A basic human desire of us is to build, to construct, right? That's certainly true. Love of feeding people. And why do you love feeding people? Baking, love of feeding people. Well, you love feeding people because you like bringing other people joy, right? That's a basic human need, to actually meet other people's needs, isn't it? Appreciation of the beauty of creation through hiking. Socializing, that's a desire for community, isn't it? Okay, lots of great answers. Oh, desire for adventure, exploration, along with meditation, scuba diving. Love those answers. Okay, great. So now here's a question for you. For that basic human desire that you just described, what can you do in the classroom to meet that human need? Human need, for instance, for construction, the human need for community, the human need for creativity, to be able to build something. The human need for comfort. Someone just talked about ukulele, bringing them comfort. Well, what can you do in your classroom to cultivate comfort? I know it seems like a stretch, right? Like, what? That's not supposed to be part of the math classroom, is it? And yet, if you think about some of the best math experiences that you've ever had, I claim they will often also involve some of these things. So for instance, when I doing math or solving a research problem, I'm often collaborating with other people. And that's one of the best things that I enjoy about doing math, is actually doing with other people, thinking about a problem together. You get to know somebody in a completely different way, just like you get to know somebody differently if you play a sport with them, right? But like you're sitting there, you're throwing out ideas without shame. I'm saying things like I'm throwing out ideas that may or may not work. They may not stick. And I don't have any shame if I'm with somebody that I trust. And so who's not going to look at me and say, oh, you're stupid for thinking that, right? Like, no, I get together with people I actually enjoy, and I think about a hard problem, right? So those are part of mathematical experiences in the workplace, right? If you have some job that requires you to think about problems, you're often working on this problem with a team, right? Now, here's another virtue: having humility, intellectual humility, to be able to say, hey, I got this far on the problem and I wasn't able to patch this gap, right? Well, why is that a good thing in a team environment? Well, it's great because then, maybe Sarah can take the where I left off and run with it, right? Maybe she can fill in the gap that I couldn't fill, right? So, and so I'm thinking about these things as I'm teaching, right? Like, for instance, I will now explicitly say on my exams, you will get more partial credit for telling me what strategic, what gaps in a problem there are, rather than trying to gloss it over and hope that I won't notice, right? Why am I doing that? Because I want to reward intellectual humility. That's a virtue. That's something I think also we should be teaching our students as well. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I am. Let's talk about a few basic human desires that we've talked about so far, and how you might cultivate that. So, for instance, if you have a desire, all of us have a desire for beauty. How can you make your classroom a place of beauty? Take a moment to think about that, and maybe, in fact, you could. Oh, and of course, many of you have typed some things in the chat here already, right? Like making the atmosphere one invitation, and of course, beauty is one way to do that, right? Creating models. You could, for instance, have a creative project that involves creating something beautiful and display those projects around the room. I have colleagues who play music. Maybe you don't actually have a classroom that you always regularly teach in. In fact, most of us don't, right? There are other ways you can cultivate sensory beauty, like playing music as students enter. And then, of course, there's other ways to cultivate mathematical beauty, highlighting the beauty of ideas, the beauty of reasoning. Not just teaching calculus as, okay, here's a bunch of tools and techniques, but actually really emphasizing that calculus is a triumph of the human imagination, right? And taking a simple idea to its, to these wonderful extremes, right? I like to say calculus is, the art of cutting things up and then putting them back together again, right? Like, that's a very simple idea that somehow has been taken to such an amazing level in being able to compute areas of things and things you couldn't even think, might not even think were possible. That's what I mean by highlighting the beauty of ideas, calling out the idea itself as beautiful, rather than just showing a bunch of techniques. Giving students space for reflection. Now, all these things, what do? I claim they cultivate virtues, right? That being reflective is a virtue. It cultivates in students an awe, transcendent awe, a gratitude, habits of generalization, when you see the same beautiful pattern show up in multiple places, right? And this is something that actually helps helps me in other areas of my life, right? Like, if I've learned to the habit of generalization, well, I do the same thing when I cook a stir fry and I need to put something together in the kitchen. Well, after reading lots of recipes, you learn a principle. The habit of generalization is, gosh, you always put chopped onions and garlic first. You heat up the oil and you throw those in, right? You put in the leafy vegetables at the end, otherwise they're going to wilt, right? These are principles, right? And it's these principles, this habit of generalization, that allows you to innovate, right? So this is what our students, this is what those employers are looking for. It's what Google's looking for. They want people who are innovators. How do you innovate? Because you have in you the virtue, this habit of generalization. Here's another human desire for exploration. And so how do you cultivate that? I think some of you already alluded to this in the chat, right? Like, well, one of the biggest ways is to change your assessments, right? Change dull problems to exploratory problems. Praise good answers, not just good questions, not just good answers. Showcase enchanting ideas, things that are fun and beautiful, but not necessarily going to be covered on the exam, right? And all these things cultivate in us virtues, right? The virtue of imagination, the virtue of curiosity. Like, oh my gosh, Professor Kernler just showed me something amazing yesterday. I wonder what he's going to do today, right? Or maybe, yeah. Anyways, and what do I mean by dull to exploratory? Well, I like this example. I like from Ben Orland's book, Math with Bad Drawings. He talked about how when you're drilling, you're giving students something to do, like for instance, do 20 area problems, multiply length times width. Okay, now of course we're not teaching at that level. We're probably doing something like take 20 derivatives in a row. Okay, now there's a reason for doing that, right? You definitely want to help students build those skills, but we should in every homework assessment have something that actually forces students to think, right? To think about the meaning of the derivative or think about the meaning of the area. So in this example, Ben's a K through 12 teacher. Example was, gosh, length times width doesn't teach anybody, have them grapple with what an area really means. And so his modification is to create two rectangles so that the first has a bigger perimeter and the second has a bigger area, right? That's more exploratory, more interesting, and creative, allows students to be creative and multiple different answers. And of course, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, gosh, well, lots of answers, but I'm going to have to go through and read and grade all those, right? Yes, that's a challenge, and I'm not going to sweep that away and say that's not a challenge. But there are two things I will say. One is that you'll have much more fun grading these questions than grading a bunch of plug and chug, and you'll learn something about how your students think. The other thing is, and I'd lean on this, is that you have two other things that are going that are in your favor. One is exploratory problems can and should be group assignments. Certainly, we leaned on that a lot in the pandemic, didn't we? Right? We wanted some of my freshmen never have ever met each other in person. So how am I getting them to interact on a Zoom screen? I'm having them do group homework assignments, right? Learning and getting to know each other that way. And giving them exploratory problems is a great way to keep it from being that one student who knows all the answers and then just does the homework by themselves, right? Exploratory. And that reduces the grading burden. The other thing is you could also have students grade each other's homeworks and verify that they actually produced an example of, that met these conditions. All right. Desire for play is another example. Many of you said this, some of you said this in the chat, giving open-ended questions. And in fact, I like giving open-ended questions that don't get answered right away, right? So often students are trained to think, okay, you even asked a question, my professor asked a question and she's going to answer it by the end of the class. Well, how about giving an interesting question that you don't answer for several weeks, or maybe you don't even have an answer for, right? Like maybe you're teaching some subject and then you think about a problem in the real world that's, that requires them to go out and use this skill. Like, for instance, how would you find the area of an airplane, right? Like, how would you do that now that you learned about Riemann sums, right? Yeah, anyways, lowering the stakes, right? I think several people mentioned that here as well. Removing high stakes from assessment to focus on the process of reflection instead of anxiety about grades. Thank you, Peter. Adopt rough draft thinking. Mandy Jansen has a nice book in which she talks about how come we don't actually help students think about doing rough drafts like we do writing, right? Like in writing, you start with a draft and then you improve it. Well, doing math is like that as well. I mean, even in the real world, you have an answer. You're like, oh, I've just estimated the number of times the toilet is flushed in this one city, and I now think I know I can make that better, right? That should be part of the way we think about math as well. It shouldn't be just like, oh, I either got it or I didn't. No, you might have an idea. Maybe it didn't quite work, and now you try to improve it. Maybe you build, how do you build upon that? That should be part of the communication we give to our students as well. Exploring multiple perspectives. Isn't that something you do in play? Whenever you play a game, you're like, oh, what is my opponent going to do? Because you're trying to see things from their point of view, aren't you? Well, that happens in math all the time, right? Like shifting back and forth between different points of view, like looking at an idea algebraically and then looking at it geometrically. And it's even part of the beauty sometimes is being able to shift back and forth. And so what does it do? What do you do by doing these things in the classroom? You cultivate virtues, right? The virtue of hopefulness that you're going to win the game, or hopefulness in this case that you're going to solve a problem. Concentration, perseverance, and the ability to change perspectives. Okay, so and so here's a question: what's happened to math education? Like, why is it that we focus primarily on skills, when in fact, if you're just going to take a utilitarian view, that employers are actually looking for virtues? Why aren't we doing more to communicate that? What would you say? What would your answer be to that question? Well, why do we strip all the best parts of doing math away from our classrooms? Feel free to speculate in the chat. Yeah, okay, so many of you are saying what I'm about to say, which is, yes, there are lots of pressures, that's certainly true. It's easier, so yeah, so it's easier, right? That's exactly that's the reason I would say as well, is that we find it easier to measure skills. It's actually hard to measure virtues. I don't want to skip over all those, some of the cool answers here in the chat, by the way, ideas that I hope you'll take time to read in the chat. Diane said, having students write a short paper of a mathematician that focuses on their life as well as the math. I think that's a great idea. Students need to see our rough drafts as well, right? Us modeling what we, yeah, that's so true. And in fact, I was just reviewing for an exam yesterday in my class, and one of my colleagues had prepared a review sheet, and I was going through it. And there was this one question I actually initially didn't know how to solve. I was like, like, I don't know how to do this, but here's how I would approach this. So that's what I did in class. I was basically winging it, but also showing students my thought process in how I would approach it. So true. We have to be modeling that as well. Yes. Okay, great. And Linda brings up a great point. Skills are needed and they're often lacking. Very, very, yes, very true. I hope you all of you don't interpret what I'm saying is to say we shouldn't be building in skills. I think what I'm saying is we shouldn't be ignoring virtues, right? Okay, so skills, yes, they're easy to assess, virtues are not. it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. So I'm just going to show you some examples of ways that I've tried to assess virtue. I know this is going to make some people uneasy because you're like, what? Seems like very subjective. Well, you know what is also subjective? It's also subjective what kinds of problems you put on the exam. It's also subjective to emphasize certain things on the exam and not other things, right? These are also subjective. Every assessment is going to involve some level of subjectivity. So I wouldn't let that be an obstacle as well. So here's an example. Any of these examples are on a blog post I wrote. If you Google 7 exam questions for a pandemic, you'll find it. But like, here's one. Take a problem you've worked this semester, you struggle to understand and solve, and explain how the struggle itself was valuable. And, I give a few more parameters here. Describing the struggle, how you overcame it, and you might discuss these things. Here's another, why am I asking this question? Because I am trying to assess persistence, right? And honestly, it's formative assessment, not summative. I'm actually, I'm happy for any reasonable answer. And guess what? Most of the answers you'll get are going to be beautiful answers. Disposition towards beauty. I asked them to consider one idea, tell me that they found beautiful, and explain why it's beautiful to you. And really, to dig in, to give some rubric, so to speak, I say explain an idea that way that can be understood by a classmate and address how this beauty is similar or different than other kinds of beauty. Again, I get some of the best answers here that actually help me in my teaching, right? Like I was teaching this class called Galois theory, okay? And whatever that is, it's about polynomials, okay? And I asked a student, I said, an answer to the question, one of my students said, they were talking about Galois groups and whatever those are. They said, they basically show me that polynomials have soulmates. And I was like, what? That's a great analogy. Like polynomials have soulmates, like other polynomials they were meant to be together with. And now that's language I use in the classroom. It's helped me be a better teacher by asking questions like this. Curiosity. What ideas are you more curious about? Strategization. For any problems you can't solve in this exam, tell me a strategy you would try to tackle it. Show what happened as a result. Describe any strategic gaps. List 3 helpful insights that may help another person trying to tackle the problem. They do all these things, full marks, right? And sometimes it's actually helped them solve the problem. Oh, not full marks, up to half credit on the problem they were trying to solve, right? But yes, what I'm communicating something with this question, and that is that I value their abilities to strategize. So assessing, look, don't sweat it. Give full or near full credit for a thoughtful answer. It's formative. But what it does is it communicates to students virtues are valuable, right? You'll get to know your students as human beings, and it'll help you teach. It'll benefit your teaching as well. And you'll enjoy reading. So I'll just finish by showing you some answers that students have given me to questions that have been reflected. How did the ideas in this course enlarge your sense of what it means to do mathematics? And of course, by the way, in asking this question, which was on a final exam, this wasn't a question that came out of the cold, right? It was something that over the class, the whole semester, I've been building this idea that, you know what, one of the things I want you to do in this class is to enlarge your view of what it means to do math. So particular student said, this class gave me a much better understanding of what it means to do math. Most of our problem sets in the class were applying theorems we learned, and the problems were comparable difficulty. But this class, we did much of the learning on our own through results that we proved. In addition, some of the problems were straightforward, but some were very, very challenging. My group didn't even have that clear idea where to start. You see, there's also group work in this class. This seems much more realistic to the life of a mathematician, where problems don't present themselves in homogeneous sets. Here's another answer to the question, which was a question about struggle. I don't have the question here, but I asked them to reflect on the value of struggle. Oh, the question is here. It's on the left. Basically, the question asks, in this class of emphasize the importance of struggling, it's normal. And when you're stuck, you should just try something. Describe an instance where struggling and trying something was valuable to you. And I got this wonderful response from a former Marine who'd come back to college after 10 years. Very, at Harvey Mudd, that's unusual. Most students are coming directly from college. And so he felt out of place often in my class. And I was aware of that. But I love this answer that he gave. He said, learning to do something with your hands is probably the equivalent of struggling to do something academically. When I was 10, I taught myself to juggle, got really good at it. I stopped juggling once I realized it wasn't cool. But 15 years later, was able to shock my wife with this hidden skill and realized I could still do it. In the Marines, required me to perform some complicated action. I'm pretty sure I'll always remember how to disassemble and assemble any cruiser machine gun. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds complicated, right? And he said, I'll remember doing these things until my body stops working. And I look at math professors effortlessly solve problems on the board, even if they didn't initially remember how to do the problem. I've seen you do this a couple of times when a student asks a good question. I think that for you, math is a lot like fixing a car or putting something together without instructions. You struggled so much that all your previous experiences are burned into your brain. You can't forget things that easily anymore because of this. Because of this, you're just better at math. Because you put in the time and the hard work. I'm hoping I can get to that level with some subject someday. This was such this response almost brought me to tears because I knew something about this kid's struggle. But the other thing is I love what he said, and again, this is something I say now in my own teaching. Doing math is a lot like putting something together without instructions. See, a lot of people think math is you need instructions, right? Like following a recipe book. No, math is a lot like putting together that IKEA piece and not looking at the instructions. All right, anyways, a great math education should build a lot of things, a lot of virtues, hopefulness, affection, habits of generalization, and our students have much more to learn in our math classes than just skills. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. We do have a little bit of time, even with our late and little rushed start there. And so I'm wondering, I've got the chat open, if anyone had any questions that you wanted to pose to Dr. Sue before he kicks off for the rest of his afternoon. Oh, and I did post up above earlier in the chat a link to his 7 questions. So if anyone's interested in using some of those.
Feel free to push back on anything I've said too. I realize it's it may be a stretch to try some of these things, but you know what? In the pandemic, I just threw everything out the window. Like, when in 2020, that spring, I decided, and I normally wouldn't do this, but I decided at that point, everybody was so stressed out. I put no questions that evaluated skills on my final exams. I just asked questions, reflection questions. And I had students, one student came to me, said to me, tearfully, she said, I cried when I got the exam because I was so stressed out about what would be on it. And I actually enjoyed this exam.
Laura did have a question in the chat, and I'm assuming Laura's thinking about just like, do you have in mind a list of virtues that you try your students to kind of gain from the semester? Do you have something in mind for that?
Do I actually have a whole list or a list of virtues that I'm explicitly trying to build? Is that maybe part of the
what do you think, Laura? What are you thinking of specifically? Yeah, maybe the ones you think are the most important, she said.
Yeah. I mean, I think it differs depending on the class. If it's a calculus class, not all my students are, they're not necessarily going to be mathematicians or, I might be emphasizing some of the virtues I think would be most important in a job context, right? Like building community and being hospitable towards one another in in the classroom, just like they would in a work context. So I often have these kinds of things in mind. I probably should, now that you mentioned it, Laura, I probably should, as much as I call these things out in the classroom, I probably should also actually explicitly write down them in a list of goals in the beginning of the year on my syllabus, which I up till now haven't. I don't think I've put on a syllabus, but that would again also communicate something. Although most students never read the syllabus anyway, so maybe it's not as important. One of the things that I did in my book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing, is I did try to think about a lot of different virtues that are built by the practice of doing mathematics. And there is an appendix at the end that kind of summarizes those, but it's by no means exhaustive, and I wouldn't claim that it is.
One thing that I think was interesting that Peter asked about, and I don't know how familiar you are with I know you've spoken at AMATIC before, so you've thought about community colleges. We kind of work under a little stricter requirement because we really have to focus on transferability and matching up the requirements of the four-year colleges. So we may have a little less flexibility over what's in a course or even what's on a final. So Peter asked if you had any advice for trying some of these things in that type of framework where you really have this transferability always in mind.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any good advice for that puzzle, other than that, there's so many moving parts here, and I think four-year institutions need to change. But I think part of the message here is that these are things that you can do that even if you're trying to establish skills, and some of them take, yes, there's time devoted to each of these things, isn't there? But part of reflection questions, changing your homework, is one way to build in some of these virtues, and reflection on these virtues, I think, is valuable. But the other thing I would say is, in terms of transferability, is often you're asked to write letters of recommendation. And on the basis of some of the answers to reflection questions, I think you could write a much better letter than one that would just simply, say this person was in my class and they got this score. But I don't think I have a good answer to the puzzle of how you get the moving pieces to both moving pieces to change.
Yeah, thanks. That's excellent. And Peter, I thought that was good as well. I put, for Laura and maybe for others, I put your Harvey Mudd department goals, which you referenced early on, and that has some of the key virtues that your department has agreed upon. That might be a good reference. Dave Lawrence, one of my colleagues at Elgin Community College, asked what you suggest for our developmental students. So these are pre-collegiate students, usually refreshing their algebra skills, to focus specifically on their studying skills. Study skills. I don't know if you had any suggestions for those kinds of students.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is that, a lot of doing math is about learning the process of thinking, and yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have specific suggestions, but in one of the classes I teach is a class called topology, and regardless of what that is, in my notes for that class, what I tried to do is to call out effective thinking principles, strategies for trying examples is an example of that, right? Like, here's a list. So yeah, when you're stuck, try an example, right? That's a sort of effective thinking principle. And I don't have that list of those things actually written down in a concise place. I do. So I have this textbook, which you could peruse, I suppose, on topology, with Michael Starbird, who's thought a lot about some of these things. It's an inquiry-based book, but I think one of the best features of it is we have these little boxes in throughout the text that call out effective thinking principles. And I wonder, I don't think we have them written down in a concise place. But the reason I bring that up is that maybe it'd be worth, there'd be some value in, well, actually, so I'm going to just mention Michael Starbird's book with Ed Berger on 5 strategies for effective thinking. They're both mathematicians, but it's sort of written for the general public. I wonder if there's some stuff in there that might be valuable to have students read.
Excellent. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but Shyam from the College of Lake County asked particularly about your partial credit question if students get stuck. Can you think of like a good response there about their struggle, their thought process? What's kind of a good response to that? They're stuck on that exam question.
Yeah, I mean, usually to a question like that, the response I get are generally very, tailored to some problem that they thought about. Yeah, I don't know that there have been particularly, most of those responses are very clinical. Like they'll analyze, okay, here's a problem, here's what I tried, and I appreciate those questions. I don't know that I have a particularly good one that I can call out, or just because they happen to be, usually very specific to the problem.
Sure. Well, I think I'm going to give myself and everyone else a couple-minute break before our 2 o'clock meeting. So, Dr. Su, thank you again so much for coming. I'll reach out. I have a couple of details we need to clarify via email. And thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference.